The dust swirled around Jeremiah's worn boots as he stumbled up the marble steps of the grandest mansion in Silver Creek. His calloused hands trembled against the ornate door, leaving smudges on the polished brass knocker. The sound echoed through the afternoon stillness like a gunshot in a cemetery. Behind him, his horse whinnied softly, sensing the desperation that clung to its master like prairie dust. The weight of his failure pressed down on his shoulders, heavier than any saddle he'd ever carried. Margaret Whitmore adjusted her black silk gloves as her butler, Harrison, announced the unexpected visitor. Through the lace curtains of her drawing room, she could see the ragged figure of a man who looked like he'd ridden through hell itself. His clothes were torn and stained with what looked like blood, and his face bore the hollow expression of a man who'd lost everything. She'd seen that look before in the mirror, the day they'd lowered her husband Edmund into the ground. The silver tea service gleamed between them like a barrier between two different worlds. The cowboy's voice cracked like dried leather when he finally spoke, his hat clutched against his chest like a shield. "Ma'am, I know I ain't got no right coming to your door looking like this, but I got nowhere else to turn." His eyes, blue as a summer sky but clouded with grief, searched her face for any sign of compassion. The words tumbled out of him like water from a broken dam, each one carrying the weight of his desperation. "They took my boy, Mrs. Whitmore, and I can't get him back alone." Margaret's composure wavered as she studied the broken man before her, remembering her own childless years of longing. She'd heard whispers about this cowboy, Jeremiah Hayes, who'd lost his wife to consumption 2 winters past. The townspeople spoke of how he'd tried to raise his 7-year-old son Samuel alone, working whatever jobs he could find. But work had been scarce, and debts had a way of growing like tumbleweeds in this unforgiving territory. Now here he stood, pride stripped away, begging for help from a woman who had everything he'd lost. "Please, ma'am," Jeremiah continued, his voice breaking completely now. "Don't let them take my son. He's all I got left of Sarah, all I got left of anything good in this world." The tears that ran down his weathered cheeks carved clean tracks through the grime and dust of his long ride. Behind him, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising rain that might wash away the evidence of his journey, but never the pain in his heart. Margaret felt something stir in her chest, something she'd thought died with Edmund 3 years ago. The story began 6 months earlier, when Samuel Hayes had fallen gravely ill with pneumonia during the harsh winter. Jeremiah had sold everything he owned, even his prized horse Thunder, to pay for the doctor's treatments and medicines. The boy had recovered, but the medical bills had left Jeremiah deeper in debt than a man could climb out of in a lifetime. When spring came, he'd tried to work double shifts at the railroad, but an injury to his back had left him barely able to walk, let alone work. The creditors had grown impatient, and their solution was as cruel as it was legal. "They say if I can't pay what I owe by sunset tomorrow, they'll take Samuel to that orphanage in Denver," Jeremiah gasped, his knees nearly buckling under the weight of his anguish. The very thought of his boy, barely 8 years old, being torn away from everything familiar, sent waves of panic through his chest. Samuel had his mother's gentle eyes and quick smile, but he was small for his age and frightened easily since Sarah's death. The idea of him alone among strangers, crying for a father who couldn't save him, was more than Jeremiah could bear. "I'll do anything, Mom. I'll work your land for free. I'll tend your horses. Margaret rose from her velvet chair with a grace that spoke of years of privilege, but her eyes held a fire that surprised even her. She'd spent 3 years drowning in her own grief, surrounded by luxury that meant nothing without someone to share it with. The townspeople saw her as the untouchable widow, too refined for their rough frontier life, too wealthy to understand their struggles. But looking at this desperate father, she saw herself in those dark months after Edmund's death, when she'd have given anything for one more day, one more chance. The clock on the mantel ticked away the seconds of Samuel's freedom like a countdown to heartbreak. "How much do you owe?" she asked quietly, her voice steady despite the storm building in her heart. Jeremiah's head snapped up, hope flickering in his eyes like a candle in the wind. $237, ma'am," he whispered, the number hanging between them like a death sentence. To Margaret, it was pocket money, the cost of a new dress or a piece of jewelry she'd never wear. To Jeremiah, it might as well have been the moon itself, impossible to reach and infinitely precious. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fear. The first drops of rain began to fall against the tall windows, each drop catching the afternoon light like tears of heaven. Margaret turned toward the window, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences, while behind her, Jeremiah held his breath like a man about to drown. She thought of Edmund, who'd always said that true wealth wasn't measured in gold, but in the lives you touched. The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest building in her heart as she prepared to make a decision that would change everything. Time was running out, and somewhere in town, a little boy named Samuel was waiting for a miracle he didn't even know he needed. Margaret's fingers traced the edge of her husband's portrait on the side table, remembering his gentle wisdom about helping those in need. Edmund had built his fortune through kindness as much as shrewd business sense, always believing that money was meant to flow like water, nourishing wherever it touched. She'd watched him pay medical bills for strangers and fund the town's first school without expecting recognition or repayment. His voice seemed to whisper in her ear now, reminding her that wealth without purpose was just pretty paper in a strongbox. The weight of his legacy pressed against her shoulders like his hands used to when he'd comfort her during thunderstorms. "Tell me about Samuel," she said softly, turning back to face the desperate cowboy whose hope hung by the thinnest of threads. Jeremiah's face transformed at the mention of his son, love chasing away some of the shadows in his eyes. "He's got his mama's way with animals, can calm the wildest horse just by talking to it gentle-like," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word about his boy. "Reads better than most grown men, too. Taught himself from Sarah's old books while I was working." Margaret found herself leaning forward, drawn into this glimpse of a child she'd never met, but somehow felt connected to. "He builds things with scraps of wood, little horses and wagons that look real enough to ride," Jeremiah continued, his calloused hands moving as if he could shape his son's creations from the air itself. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, the kind of love that only a parent could understand. "Sometimes I catch him talking to his mama's picture, telling her about his day like she's right there listening." Margaret's breath caught in her throat, remembering her own conversations with Edmund's portrait during the loneliest nights. The shared experience of loss created an invisible bridge between them, spanning the vast gulf of their different circumstances. Outside, the storm intensified, and Margaret remembered another stormy night 3 years ago when she'd made a different kind of desperate bargain with fate. She'd knelt beside Edmund's deathbed, promising God anything if he'd just let her husband live one more day, one more hour. But dawn had come anyway, taking Edmund with it and leaving her with more money than she could spend and a heart too broken to care. "He sounds like a remarkable boy," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "What kind of men are threatening to take him?" "Banker named Cornelius Ashford and his partner, a lawyer called Morrison," Jeremiah spat, his grief transforming into anger that burned like prairie fire. These were men who measured human suffering in dollars and cents, who saw a child's tears as nothing more than an inconvenience to their business dealings. They got the law on their side, papers all signed and legal, saying they got the right to collect on my debts any way they see fit. His fists clenched at his sides, muscles tensing with the frustrated rage of a man bound by rules that favored the powerful. Margaret knew both men by reputation, vultures who circled the desperate and fed on misfortune. The clock chimed 5 o'clock, each note echoing through the room like a funeral bell counting down to Samuel's fate. 6 hours, Jeremiah whispered, the number falling from his lips like a physical blow. Margaret could see him calculating the time it would take to ride back to town, to hold his son one more time before the unthinkable happened. The rain pelted the windows harder now, as if the sky itself was weeping for the injustice about to unfold. She thought of all the empty rooms in her mansion, all the silence that money couldn't fill. "Mr. Hayes," Margaret said, her voice carrying a new note of determination that surprised them both. "I want you to know that what you're feeling right now, this desperation to protect your child, it's not weakness." She stood and walked to her desk, pulling out a leather-bound checkbook that represented power she'd forgotten she possessed. "A parent's love is the strongest force in creation, stronger than law, stronger than money, stronger than death itself." Jeremiah watched her with growing amazement as she dipped her pen in ink with steady, purposeful strokes. The scratch of the pen across paper sounded like salvation being written into existence, but as Margaret began to write, a commotion outside made them both freeze. Through the rain-streaked windows they could see riders approaching, their horses' hooves throwing up mud as they galloped toward the mansion. "That's Ashford's men," Jeremiah breathed, his face going pale as cemetery marble. The banker had grown impatient, unwilling to wait until the deadline to claim his prize. 3 men in dark coats rode through the storm like harbingers of doom, their faces set with the cold determination of those who profit from others' pain. Margaret felt something fierce and protective surge through her veins like liquid fire. "They can't just take him early, can they?" Margaret demanded, but the look on Jeremiah's face told her everything she needed to know. In a territory where might often made right, men like Ashford bent the rules to suit their purposes. The riders dismounted outside, their spurs jingling like chains as they approached the front door. Jeremiah stumbled backward, his hand instinctively reaching for a gun that wasn't there, sold weeks ago to buy medicine for Samuel. Margaret watched the cowboy who'd begged for help transform into a father ready to fight impossible odds with his bare hands. The sound of boots on the front steps echoed through the house like a death march, each footfall bringing them closer to a confrontation that would determine a little boy's future. Margaret looked at the half-written check in her hands, knowing that money alone might not be enough to stop what was coming. Harrison appeared in the doorway, his usually composed face showing concern as he announced, "Ma'am, there are men here to see Mr. Hayes. They say it's a matter of legal business." The moment of truth had arrived sooner than anyone expected, and Margaret realized she was about to discover exactly what the unthinkable really meant. Cornelius Ashford strode into Margaret's drawing room like a man who owned the world, his expensive suit untouched by the storm outside. Behind him followed Morrison, the lawyer, clutching a leather satchel full of legal documents, and a third man Margaret didn't recognize, a bounty hunter by the look of his weathered face and cold eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore," Ashford said with a smile that never reached his eyes, "forgive the intrusion, but we have business with Mr. Hayes here." His gaze fell on Jeremiah like a vulture eyeing carrion, satisfied and predatory. The banker's presence filled the elegant room with menace, making the fine furnishings seem fragile and meaningless. "The boy is already in our custody," Morrison announced, producing a set of official-looking papers from his satchel with theatrical flourish. The words hit Jeremiah like physical blows, staggering him backward into Margaret's china cabinet. "You took Samuel?" he gasped, his voice breaking into fragments of disbelief and rage. Margaret watched the color drain from the cowboy's face as Morrison nodded with cruel satisfaction. "Standard procedure when dealing with delinquent debtors, Mr. Hayes. We've learned that waiting until the last minute often leads to complications." The lawyer's smirk revealed teeth yellowed by tobacco and moral decay. "Where is he?" Jeremiah roared, lunging forward only to find himself face to face with the bounty hunter's drawn pistol. The man's eyes were flat as a snake's, indifferent to the father's anguish. "The boy is safe and sound in the Silver Creek jail," Ashford said casually, as if discussing the weather rather than a child's imprisonment. "He'll remain there until we can arrange transport to the Denver orphanage tomorrow morning." Margaret felt her blood turn to ice at the casual cruelty in the banker's voice, the way he spoke of Samuel like merchandise to be shipped. Her hands clenched into fists inside her silk gloves, nails digging into her palms. "Are you monsters?" Margaret whispered, her voice carrying an authority that made all three men pause. She'd found her voice at last, the one Edmund had always said could move mountains when she chose to use it. "He's just a child, barely 8 years old, and you've locked him in a jail cell like a common criminal." Ashford's smile widened at her outrage, feeding on her distress like a parasite. "Business is business, Mrs. Whitmore. Perhaps if Mr. Hayes had been more responsible with his finances, his son wouldn't find himself in this unfortunate situation." The banker's words dripped with false sympathy and genuine malice. But Margaret was no longer the grieving widow hiding behind wealth and isolation. Something had awakened in her, something fierce and protective that burned away 3 years of numbness and self-pity. "How much does he owe you?" she demanded, pulling out her checkbook with movements sharp as a blade. $237, Morrison replied, consulting his papers with bureaucratic precision. "Plus interest, late fees, and collection costs. Call it 400 even." The number hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, heavy with the power to destroy or save. 400 it is, Margaret said, her pen flying across the check with strokes as decisive as sword cuts. But as she signed her name with a flourish that spoke of righteous fury, Ashford held up his hand with theatrical timing. "I'm afraid it's too late for that, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice dripping with false regret. "The debt collection process has already begun. Legal procedures must be followed." Margaret looked up from the check, confusion and growing rage warring in her chest. Morrison nodded sagely, as if explaining a complex legal principle to a simple child. "What procedures?" she demanded, but the sinking feeling in her stomach already knew the answer. "Once a child enters protective custody due to parental neglect," the lawyer explained with obvious relish, The matter becomes one for the territorial courts to decide. Money alone cannot resolve it. Jeremiah made a sound like a wounded animal, the last of his hope crumbling like a house built on sand. The bounty hunter's gun never wavered, keeping the desperate father at bay while his world collapsed around him. Margaret stared at the useless check in her hands, realizing that wealth meant nothing against the corruption of law itself. "You planned this," she said slowly, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. These men hadn't come early out of impatience. They'd come to make sure no last-minute salvation could intervene. You knew someone might try to pay his debts, so you moved the boy beyond the reach of money. Ashford's answering smile was all the confirmation she needed. "We're simply being thorough, Mrs. Whitmore. Can't have debtors thinking they can avoid their responsibilities at the last moment." The casual evil in his voice made her stomach turn with disgust and rage. But as Margaret stared into the banker's cold eyes, something clicked into place in her mind. These men had underestimated her, seeing only a wealthy widow too refined for their rough world. They'd forgotten that Edmund Whitmore hadn't built his fortune through weakness, and that his wife had been his partner in more than just name. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice suddenly as smooth as silk and twice as dangerous, "I believe you may have made a rather serious miscalculation." The change in her tone was subtle, but unmistakable, like the moment before lightning strikes. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if the very elements were holding their breath for what would come next. Margaret set down the useless check and walked to Edmund's desk, her movements graceful but predatory. From a locked drawer, she withdrew a different kind of document, one that made Morrison's face go pale when he glimpsed the official seal. "You see, gentlemen," Margaret continued, her voice now carrying the weight of true power, "there are laws about kidnapping children, even in the name of debt collection." The paper crinkled in the silence like bones breaking, and suddenly the hunters realized they might have become the hunted. The document Margaret held bore the seal of the territorial governor, a man who owed his political career to Edmund Whitmore's financial backing years ago. "This is a gubernatorial order granting me emergency authority to investigate child welfare cases in this county," she announced, her voice ringing with newfound power. Morrison's hands shook as he reached for the paper, his legal mind racing through the implications, while sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. Ashford's confident smile faltered for the first time, replaced by the dawning realization that they'd cornered a lioness, not a lamb. The bounty hunter's gun hand trembled slightly, unsure now who represented the real authority in the room. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "taking a child from his home without proper court proceedings constitutes kidnapping under territorial law, regardless of debt status." She moved toward the men with the fluid grace of a predator closing in for the kill, years of suppressed grief transforming into righteous fury. "The penalty for kidnapping, gentlemen, is 20 years in the territorial prison, assuming you survive the rope." Jeremiah watched in amazement as the widow he'd begged for help revealed herself to be something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The balance of power in the room had shifted like sand in an hourglass, and suddenly, the desperate father wasn't alone anymore. Ashford stammered, his practiced composure cracking like thin ice under spring sun. "Now see here, Mrs. Whitmore, this is all perfectly legal. We have documentation," but Margaret cut him off with a gesture sharp as a blade. "Documentation signed by whom? A county clerk who takes bribes, or a judge who owes you money?" Her words hit their targets with devastating precision, each accusation based on rumors she'd heard but never cared to investigate until now. Did you really think Edmund Whitmore's widow would be ignorant of the corruption festering in this territory's legal system? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. The truth was that Margaret had spent 3 years in willful ignorance, drowning in grief, while evil men twisted justice to line their pockets. But Edmund's papers, locked away in his desk, contained a different kind of inheritance, evidence of corruption, bribery, and extortion that he'd gathered but never used. "My husband believed in second chances," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of justice too long delayed. "He documented your crimes, but hoped you'd reform yourselves." She spread the papers across her desk like playing cards in a high-stakes game. "I have no such faith in human nature." Morrison's face had gone grey as cemetery stone as he recognized bank records, forged documents, and testimony from victims too frightened to speak publicly. "You can't prove any of this in court," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret smiled, and for the first time in years it wasn't sad or hollow but filled with genuine warmth. "I don't need to prove it in court, Mr. Morrison. I simply need to ensure it reaches the right newspapers in Denver and Washington. The lawyer's briefcase fell from nerveless fingers, papers scattering across the floor like leaves before a storm. "Here's what's going to happen," Margaret announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally found her purpose again. "You're going to return Samuel Hayes to his father immediately, and you're going to forgive the entire debt." Ashford opened his mouth to protest, but she silenced him with a look that could freeze fire. "In return, I won't destroy your lives with the evidence I possess." The bounty hunter slowly holstered his weapon, recognizing defeat when it stared him in the face. "And if you ever threaten this family again, I'll ensure you spend your remaining years breaking rocks in the territorial prison." But Margaret wasn't finished with her unthinkable act of salvation. "Furthermore, Mr. Hayes will be employed as my ranch foreman at a salary of $50 per month, with housing provided for him and his son." Jeremiah's knees nearly buckled at this unexpected generosity, tears streaming down his weathered face as hope bloomed in his chest like wildflowers after rain. "Samuel will attend the territory's finest schools, and both father and son will have a home for as long as they wish it." The offer was more than Jeremiah had dared dream, a complete transformation of their desperate circumstances into something approaching paradise. The three men slunk out of the mansion like whipped dogs, their grand schemes crumbling into dust, and their reputations hanging by threads they dared not test. Within an hour, they returned with Samuel, a small boy with bright eyes and his mother's gentle smile, clutching a carved wooden horse he'd made from scraps. The reunion between father and son was a thing of beauty, tears and laughter mixing like summer rain and sunshine. Margaret watched from the doorway, her heart fuller than it had been since Edmund's death, understanding finally what her husband had meant about wealth finding its true purpose. As the storm cleared and stars began to appear through the breaking clouds, three figures sat on the mansion's front porch: a broken cowboy made whole, a frightened child safe in his father's arms, and a lonely widow who'd found her reason for living again. "Why did you do it?" Jeremiah asked quietly, his voice thick with gratitude and wonder. Margaret looked out across the land that would now ring with a child's laughter and smiled. "Because sometimes the unthinkable is simply what we should have been thinking all along." Years later, when Samuel Hayes became a successful rancher himself, he would tell his own children about the night a rich widow chose love over law, justice over profit, and proved that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to let evil win. The wooden horse he'd carved in that jail cell sat on his mantle, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, miracles can still happen when someone finds the courage to do the unthinkable. And in Silver Creek, they still tell the story of how Margaret Whitmore saved more than just a boy that stormy night. She saved herself.